On a cold and stormy day in April 2003, a person walking their dog along the muddy shores of the San Francisco Bay looked down and saw something that stopped their heart. It was a sight so sad and so shocking that it would change the town of Modesto, California, forever. For months, the whole country had been looking for a beautiful, smiling woman named Laci Peterson, who had disappeared on Christmas Eve while she was 8 months pregnant. Thousands of people had searched parks, rivers, and forests, hoping to find her safe. But there, in the cold water, the ocean finally gave up its darkest secret. The mystery of where Laci had gone was over, but the truth of what had happened to her was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. As the police tape went up and the sirens began to wail, everyone had the same chilling question: how did a happy home turn into a crime scene? And who was the monster hiding in plain sight? To understand how this nightmare began, we have to go back to the sunny streets of Modesto. Laci Peterson was 27 years old, and she was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. She had a big, dimpled smile and loved to cook, garden, and talk to her friends. In the year 2002, Laci was the happiest she had ever been. She was married to a man named Scott Peterson, who was handsome and worked as a salesman. They lived in a pretty house with a nice yard, and they were getting ready for the biggest adventure of their lives. Laci was pregnant with a baby boy, and they had already picked out his name. Connor. Laci spent her days getting the house ready for the baby. She painted the nursery a soft color and picked out tiny clothes and blankets. Her friends said she was glowing with joy. Scott seemed like a great husband, too. He helped her around the house and went to doctor appointments with her. To anyone looking from the outside, the Petersons were the perfect American family. They had a golden retriever named Mackenzie, and they spent their weekends going to parties and visiting their parents. Life was calm, quiet, and filled with the smell of home-cooked meals and the excitement of a new baby coming soon. The holidays were Laci's favorite time of year. On December 23, 2002, Laci went to the grocery store to buy food for a big Christmas dinner. She talked to her mom on the phone that night, sounding happy and making plans for the next day. Scott told everyone that the next morning, December 24th, he got up early to go fishing. He said Laci was still awake and planned to take the dog for a walk in the nearby park. He kissed her goodbye and drove away in his truck, leaving Laci alone in their quiet house. But when Scott came home later that evening, the house was strangely quiet. The lights were off, and Laci wasn't in the kitchen cooking. He found the dog, Mackenzie, still wearing his leash, wandering in the backyard. Scott called Laci's mom and asked if Laci was there. When she said no, a cold wave of fear began to spread. Soon, the police arrived at the house. They used flashlights to look in every room, calling Laci's name, but only silence answered them. Within hours, the neighborhood was filled with people carrying flashlights and posters. Christmas Eve, usually the happiest night of the year, turned into a desperate search for a missing mother. As the sun began to rise on Christmas morning, the police started to notice things that didn't feel right. They talked to Scott about his fishing trip. He told them he had gone to a place called the Berkeley Marina, which was nearly 90 miles away from their home. The police wondered why a man would drive so far to go fishing on a cold, cloudy day right before Christmas when his wife was 8 months pregnant. They looked at his boat and his truck, and they began to ask more questions. While Laci's family was crying and praying for her return, Scott seemed very calm. He didn't look like a man whose world had just fallen apart. Days turned into weeks, and the search grew bigger and bigger. People from all over California came to Modesto to help. They walked through the mud and the rain, shouting Laci's name until their voices were hoarse. Volunteers set up a command center with maps and phones. Laci's face was on every television screen and every newspaper in America. Everyone wanted to find her. But as the new year began, the police made a discovery that changed everything. They found out that Scott had been keeping a massive secret. He wasn't the perfect husband everyone thought he was. He had been seeing another woman, a massage therapist named Amber Frey, and he had told her that he was lost and that his wife was already gone, long before Laci actually disappeared. This news was like a bomb going off. The town that had supported Scott suddenly began to look at him with suspicion. Was it possible that the man who smiled in family photos was actually a liar? The police began to follow Scott everywhere. They put trackers on his car and listened to his phone calls. They searched the Berkeley Marina with divers and sonar equipment, looking into the deep, dark water where Scott said he had been fishing. The tension in Modesto was pulling tight, like a rubber band about to snap. Then, just as the search was hitting its most difficult point, the police received a tip about something strange found in Scott's warehouse, where he kept his boat. They found handmade anchors made of concrete, but some of them were missing. The investigators realized that if someone wanted to hide something in the ocean, they might use heavy weights to keep it down. On a dark night in April, a massive storm rolled in over the San Francisco Bay, churning up the water and pulling at the bottom of the sea. The next morning, the storm moved away, leaving the shore littered with debris. And that is when the dog walker saw it. The final, heartbreaking proof that the perfect life in Modesto had been a lie, and the person everyone was looking for had been right where Scott Peterson said he was fishing all along. The discovery on the shoreline changed everything in an instant, turning a missing person search into a grim murder investigation. As the police carefully gathered the evidence from the sand, they realized that the ocean had kept this secret for 4 long months, but the truth was finally coming to light. Forensic scientists worked through the night, using DNA and dental records to confirm what everyone already feared in their hearts. It was Laci and her unborn son, Connor. The news hit the United States like a physical blow. People who had never even met Laci cried in their living rooms, and the yellow ribbons that had been tied to trees all over Modesto for months were suddenly replaced with black ones. The high of finding the truth was met with the low of a crushing, national sadness. But as the town mourned, the police realized they had a new mission. They had to find Scott Peterson before he disappeared too. While the world was staring at the news reports from the San Francisco Bay, Scott was not at home in Modesto. He had changed his appearance completely. The man who once had dark hair and a clean-shaven face now had bleached blonde hair and a goatee. He was driving a different car, a red Mercedes he had bought with cash, and he was carrying nearly $15,000 in his pocket. He also had several cell phones, camping gear, and his brother's driver's license. It looked like he was preparing to cross the border into Mexico. This was a moment of extreme suspense. The police were watching him from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce before he could vanish forever. The arrest happened near a golf course in San Diego. Detectives pulled him over and walked up to his window with their guns drawn. Scott didn't fight. He sat there with his blonde hair and his bag of cash, looking like a man who knew the game was finally over. He was handcuffed and driven back to Modesto, where crowds of angry people lined the streets, shouting for justice. The low of the quiet jail cell was a sharp contrast to the high of the chaotic streets outside. Scott was charged with the murder of his wife and son, a crime that carried the heaviest penalty in California. The trial began in 2004, and it was unlike anything the country had seen before. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, family members, and curious strangers. The prosecutors told a story of a man who wanted a different life, a life without a wife and a baby, and who thought he could get away with the perfect crime by using his boat in the deep water of the bay. They showed the jury the boat, the fishing lures that had never been used, and the handmade concrete anchors. They played recordings of Scott's phone calls to Amber Frey, where he lied about being in Paris while he was actually at his wife's candlelight vigil. The jury listened to Scott's voice, sounding happy and romantic on the phone, while thousands of people were searching the woods for Laci, but Scott's lawyers fought back. They argued that there was no smoking gun. There were no witnesses who saw what happened in the house. The police officers stood on the wet sand of the San Francisco Bay, their breath misting in the cold air as they looked at the evidence the ocean had finally returned. This was the most extreme peak of the entire mystery. For months, Scott Peterson had told everyone he was just a lucky fisherman, but the location where Laci was found was exactly where he had put his boat into the water on that lonely Christmas Eve. The news spread across the United States like wildfire. People in Modesto cried on their porches, and news cameras swarmed the streets. But as the police moved in to make an arrest, they realized Scott was no longer at home. He had dyed his hair a strange orange-blonde color, grew a goatee to hide his face, and was driving a different car near the border of Mexico with survival gear and thousands of dollars in cash. It looked like he was about to vanish forever, leaving the truth buried in the sand before the handcuffs clicked shut on Scott's wrists. The story had to settle into a long, quiet wait for justice. After the discovery at the bay, Scott was brought back to Modesto in a police car, surrounded by angry crowds shouting for answers. He was placed in a small jail cell, far away from the pretty house with a nursery and the golden retriever. This was a low point in the story, a time of hushed whispers in law enforcement offices and long meetings between lawyers. The perfect husband was now a prisoner, and the whole country was waiting to see if a jury would believe a man could do something so terrible to his own family. The trial began in a crowded courtroom in Redwood City. Every day, Laci's mother, Sharon, sat in the front row, holding a photo of her daughter. It was a very sad and slow process. The lawyers talked about fishing lures, boat weights, and cell phone towers. They showed pictures of the warehouse where Scott kept his boat and the concrete anchors he had made. The highs of the trial came when Amber Frey, the woman Scott had lied to, walked into the room. She stood on the witness stand and played secret tape recordings of Scott's voice. In the recordings, Scott sounded happy and romantic, even though he knew the whole world was looking for his missing wife. The jury listened in total silence, realizing that the man in the expensive suit had two different lives. During the low moments of the trial, the lawyers argued about the wind and the tides of the bay. They brought in experts to talk about how water moves and how things sink or float. Scott sat at his table, usually looking bored or calm, which made the people watching very uncomfortable. He never cried, and he never explained why he had lied so many times. The suspense in the courtroom grew every single day. Was there enough proof? There were no witnesses to the crime, and no one had found a weapon. It was a giant puzzle made of tiny pieces of paper, phone calls, and the cold, gray water of the San Francisco Bay. Wide as the months dragged on, the jury finally went into a private room to make their choice. For several days, the town of Modesto held its breath. People stood outside the courthouse with signs, waiting for the final word. Then, the bell rang. The jury was ready. The courtroom was packed so tight that people were leaning against the walls. The judge asked Scott to stand up. The air felt heavy, like the moments before a massive thunderstorm. When the clerk read the word, guilty, a huge gasp went up from the crowd. Laci's family hugged each other and sobbed, finally feeling like the truth had won. But the story didn't end with the verdict. Even after Scott was sent to prison, new questions began to pop up like weeds in a garden. Years later, a group of lawyers started to look at the case again. They claimed that some of the people on the jury hadn't been honest, and that there was new evidence that hadn't been shown to the public. They talked about a robbery that happened across the street from the Peterson house on the same day Laci disappeared. This was a new high of suspense. Could the wrong man be in jail? Could the perfect crime have been committed by someone else entirely? The legal battle went on for a long time, moving from one court to another. Scott's death sentence was taken away, and he was given life in prison instead. In 2024 and 2025, the Los Angeles Innocence Project even stepped in to help look for DNA evidence that might have been missed 20 years ago. The story of Laci Peterson became a never-ending mystery that kept the United States talking. Every time people thought the case was over, a new door would open. On a quiet night in 2026, as the moon shone over the San Francisco Bay, a new investigator sat in a small office surrounded by the original boxes of evidence. He picked up a dusty envelope that had never been opened. It contained a tiny piece of fabric found near the shore that had been overlooked for decades. As he walked over to the microscope to look at it, he heard a loud knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and when he looked at the security camera, he saw a person wearing a dark hoodie, standing perfectly still, holding a sign that had only one word written on it: wait.